his gaze, her lips parting, ready to argue. But the kindness in his eyes disarmed her. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as a burden, not as a woman broken by circumstances, but as a mother who was fighting with everything she had to keep her child safe. Annie ate eagerly, her little cheeks flushed with warmth. Watching her daughter's small joy, Clara felt tears sting her eyes, though she quickly blinked them back. She had promised herself never to cry in front of strangers again. But Luke wasn't just a stranger. There was something about him, something that felt steady, like the ground she had been searching for all this time. After a while, Annie grew sleepy, her little head nodding against her mother's shoulder. That was when Luke leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "You don't have to tell me the whole of it, not if you ain't ready. But I can see clear as daylight that you've been carrying more than a woman should ever have to. And I'll tell you this right now. I've got room in my life for all of you." Clara froze, his words hitting her like a wave. "All of us?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Luke nodded slowly, and before she could even process it, he reached across and carefully lifted Annie into his arms. The little girl stirred but didn't cry. Instead, she nestled against him as if she had known him all her life. Clara's breath caught in her chest. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered, overwhelmed. "You don't know where we've come from, or what we've endured." Luke looked at her, steady as the horizon at dawn. "Maybe not, but I know what I see right here. A woman strong enough to walk away from what tried to break her. A little girl who deserves a man to carry her without fear. And I know that I've got an empty house sitting on a ridge, with more space than I need. And a heart that's got room enough for the both of you." The boarding house had gone quieter, as though even the wind outside had paused to listen. Clara pressed her trembling fingers to her lips, torn between disbelief and the aching hope rising in her chest. Annie stirred again in Luke's arms, and he rocked her gently, murmuring something soft that only she could hear. Clara watched as her daughter's tiny hand rested trustingly on his coat. That single gesture broke something inside Clara, the wall she had built to protect herself. Tears rolled freely down her cheeks, and for the first time she didn't wipe them away. Luke stood then, tall and unyielding, with Annie cradled close against him. He extended his other hand toward Clara. "You don't have to decide everything tonight, but for now let me carry her inside into warmth and safety. Let me help carry both of you, for as long as you'll let me." Clara's hand trembled as she reached out. When his calloused palm closed around hers, a spark of strength passed between them. Not the fleeting kind of hope she had been chasing, but something rooted, something real. They walked together, across the room, the firelight painting golden halos around them. And when Luke pushed open the door to the small private parlor beyond, the warmth embraced them like home. And in that moment, Clara knew her life had changed. Not because a cowboy had offered help, but because he had offered space, not just in his home, but in his heart. "I've got room in my life for all of you," he repeated quietly, carrying Annie past the threshold. Clara followed, her steps no longer heavy with fear, but light with the beginning of something new. And so began a story not of rescue alone, but of belonging, of healing, and of love found in the unlikeliest of places. A cowboy, a woman, and her little girl, three hearts that had been wandering separate. Trails now found themselves on the same path. And for everyone watching this tale unfold, remember, sometimes the room you think is empty in your life is exactly where love is meant to move in. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because more powerful stories like this one are waiting for you. Stories that remind us that hope, love, and courage still ride strong in this world. Subscribe now and be part of this journey. The firelight in the small parlor flickered against the wooden walls, its glow softening the rough edges of the place, and for a moment Clara simply stood there, watching Luke as he gently laid Annie down on the sofa, tucking a quilt around her with a tenderness that didn't belong to a man. Hardened by the trail, the sight made something deep inside Clara stir, a longing she hadn't let herself feel in years. She had always carried the burden of protecting her little girl alone, never once believing another set of arms could be trusted. But the way Annie clung to Luke's coat even in her sleep told her a truth her heart had been too afraid to hear. Her daughter already trusted this man. Luke turned then, his hat in his hand, his eyes steady on Clara. "She'll sleep sound, don't you worry. But you When's the last time you rested proper? The question hit her like a stone, for she couldn't remember. Every night had been a watch, every morning another battle to keep going. Clara's lips parted, but no words came, only a faint shake of her head. Luke studied her for a long moment, then motioned toward the armchair by the fire. Sit, just for a spell. You don't need to carry the, world every minute. His, voice wasn't demanding, it was patient. Steady, like the quiet hush of a river that knows its current will wear down even the strongest rock in time. Reluctantly, Clara lowered herself into the chair, her body aching with exhaustion she hadn't acknowledged until now. The heat of the fire seeped into her bones, and before she could protest, Luke draped a blanket across her lap. I'm not used to anyone fussing over me, she admitted softly, her voice trembling. Well, Luke replied with a small smile. Then it's high time someone started. Silence stretched between them, but the snow was falling in soft curtains outside the small town of Ash Hollow, flakes drifting past the lamplight like they had a mind of their own, silent and steady. The woman stood just inside the old boarding house porch, clutching her little girl close, her arms trembling from both cold and fear. Her name was Clara, and life had not been kind to her lately. She had left everything behind, the cruel man who had once called, himself her husband, the judgmental whispers of neighbors who never knew what it was to fight for survival, and the aching loneliness of nights where even hope seemed too expensive to afford. Now all she had was her daughter, Annie, a small thing with bright blue eyes and curls tangled from the journey. They had nowhere left to go. Inside the boarding house, voices murmured, boots scuffed the wooden floorboards, and laughter rose in bursts around the warm fire. The sound made Clara hesitate. She felt like an intruder, a ghost at the edge of someone else's comfort. Then the door swung wide, and there he was, the cowboy people in town often talked about. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a dust-worn hat in his hand, his coat smelling faintly of saddle leather and the open plains. His name was Luke, though most just called him the cowboy, for he carried himself with that timeless air of a man who belonged everywhere yet tied himself to no place at all. His gaze softened when it fell on the small girl bundled in Clara's arms. Annie peeked out shyly, her little hands clutching her mother's shawl, and the cowboy smiled in a way that seemed to carry warmth straight into the marrow of Clara's bones. Ma'am, he said gently, tipping his hat. This ain't no place to be standing out in the cold. You and your little one come on inside. Clara hesitated, her pride clashing with her desperation. We don't mean to trouble anyone, she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. We're just passing through. Luke shook his head. No one with a child in their arms should be left standing on a porch when there's a fire burning inside. Not while I've got a say in it. His words weren't sharp, but there was a kind of steady strength behind them that made it impossible to refuse. Clara nodded, her throat tight, and followed him into the room. The warmth wrapped around them instantly. Annie's eyes lit up at the sight of the fire, and she leaned forward, reaching out her tiny fingers as if to catch the glow. Clara bent low to whisper in her daughter's ear. Don't stare, sweetheart, but Luke overheard and chuckled. Let her stare. Fire's a mighty fine thing for a child to marvel at. Reminds us there's still beauty in this world. He led them to a table in the corner, where the noise was softer, and signaled for coffee and a bowl of stew to be brought over. Clara wanted to protest they couldn't pay, but before she could open her mouth, Luke set his hand gently on the table, as if to anchor her trembling heart. Don't worry. Tonight's on me, she met. It wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the steady breathing of Annie, and the unspoken weight of two people standing at the edge of something new. After a while, Clara found herself speaking, words she hadn't thought she'd ever share. She told him about the nights she'd spent walking roads alone, about the man who had broken every promise he ever made to her, about the fear that never left her chest. She didn't give details at first, only fragments, but Luke listened as though every word mattered, never interrupting, never judging. When she finally fell silent, ashamed of how much she had revealed, Luke leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. You've walked through hell, Clara, he said gently, but you didn't let it take your soul. That tells me more about you than any tale ever could. Her eyes stung, with tears again, and she turned her face away, embarrassed. But Luke reached out, not to force her gaze back, but to lay a calloused hand over hers, warm and grounding. I ain't here to erase your past, he continued, his voice steady as a promise. But I'd sure like to be part of your future. Both of yours. Clara swallowed hard. Part of her wanted to pull back, to shield herself from the risk of trusting again. But another part, quieter, gentler, was beginning to believe that maybe trust didn't always lead to pain. Maybe sometimes it led to healing. Annie stirred then, mumbling in her sleep, and Luke rose to check on her. He adjusted the quilt, brushing a strand of hair from her small face, and Clara felt her chest tighten at the sight. This was what she had always dreamed of for her daughter. A man who would care, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Later, when Annie was settled and the fire burned lower, Luke fetched 2 mugs of coffee from the kitchen and set one in front of Clara. It ain't much, he said with a small grin, but it'll keep you warm. She wrapped her hands around the mug, inhaling the steam, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she laughed, a soft, surprised sound that made Luke's eyes brighten. What's funny? He asked, smiling. Just this, she admitted, gesturing to the cozy room, to her daughter sleeping peacefully, to him sitting across from her as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't think nights like this still existed for me. Luke's smile deepened, though there was a flicker of something serious in his gaze. Then let's make sure it ain't the last one. The words lingered in the air, bold and tender all at once, and Clara didn't know how to respond. But deep down, she knew her answer was already forming in the steady rhythm of her heart. Hours slipped by, and when Clara finally drifted into sleep, Luke kept watch, the firelight glinting off his quiet eyes. He had made promises before, but never like this. This wasn't about duty or pride. This was about love, not the kind spoken hate.